80,000 soldiers surrendered to an army less than half their size. The greatest fortress in the British Empire fell in just 7 days, and the men who could have prevented this disaster were told to shut up and follow orders. This is the story they tried to bury for decades. The story of how Australian officers saw the catastrophe coming months in advance, how they begged and pleaded with British High Command to listen, and how those warnings were dismissed with 5 words that would condemn thousands to captivity and worse. The Bushmen know nothing about modern warfare. That was the official verdict from the generals with polished boots and cut-glass accents, the same generals who believed Japanese soldiers could not see in the dark, the same generals who thought the jungle was impassable, the same generals who pointed their massive guns out to sea while the enemy rolled in from the north on bicycles. What you are about to hear is not the sanitized version from British history books. This is the raw truth about institutional arrogance, ignored intelligence, and the colonial contempt that turned Singapore into a death trap. Why did Churchill call this the worst disaster in British military history? What did Australian commanders know that London refused to believe? And what really happened in those final chaotic days when the impregnable fortress crumbled like wet cardboard? Stay with me until the end, because the answers will change everything you thought you knew about this war. 15,000 Australian soldiers stand in the blazing tropical heat of Changi. Their rifles lie in piles at their feet. Japanese guards with fixed bayonets herd them like cattle toward the wire. It is the 15th of February, 1942. The greatest military disaster in the history of the British Empire has just unfolded. And here is the terrible truth that London will try to bury for decades. Australian intelligence officers warned them. Australian commanders begged them. Australian soldiers screamed that the Japanese were coming through the jungle from the north. The British High Command looked at these sunburned men from the colonies and delivered their verdict. The Bushmen know nothing about modern warfare. 80,000 Allied troops have just surrendered to a Japanese force of 30,000. The impregnable fortress of Singapore has fallen in 7 days. Winston Churchill will call it the worst disaster in British military history. But this catastrophe was not caused by Japanese brilliance alone. It was engineered by British arrogance, imperial blindness, and a poisonous contempt for anyone who dared challenge the wisdom of Whitehall. But the seeds of this catastrophe were planted years before the first shot was fired. The great imperial fantasy started with a map and a delusion. Singapore sat at the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula like a crown jewel. The British called it the Gibraltar of the East. They poured millions of pounds into its defences. They built enormous 15-inch naval guns that could hurl shells 20 miles out to sea. They constructed airfields and barracks and officers' clubs with ceiling fans and white-jacketed servants. There was just one problem. The entire defensive strategy assumed that any attack would come from the sea. The jungle to the north was considered impassable. The official British assessment stated that no army could move heavy equipment through the dense Malayan rainforest. The rubber plantations and mangrove swamps would swallow any invasion force. This was the wisdom of men who had studied maps in London, but had never set foot in the actual terrain. Yet not everyone was blind to the obvious. Australian military observers thought differently. Lieutenant Colonel Frederick 97th Gough of the Australian Army submitted a report in 1936 that explicitly warned of a land-based invasion through Malaya. He described exactly how Japanese forces could move through the jungle using bicycles and light vehicles. He outlined the vulnerabilities of the northern approaches. His report was filed and forgotten. Major General Henry Gordon Bennett arrived in Malaya in 1941 to command the Australian 8th Division. He was a difficult man, abrasive and ambitious, but he understood jungle warfare. He had trained his troops for exactly the kind of fighting the British considered impossible. His warnings were treated with the same contempt. The pattern was always the same. An Australian officer would raise concerns, a British staff officer would dismiss them. The colonials simply did not understand modern warfare. They were sheep farmers and cattle drovers playing at soldiers. The real military minds were in London and Singapore, where proper officers drank gin and tonics and assured each other that the Japanese were a second-rate enemy. But even this arrogance paled compared to what British intelligence believed about their enemy. The Japanese war machine had been grinding through Asia for a decade. They had conquered Manchuria in 1931. They had invaded China proper in 1937. Their soldiers had proved themselves in brutal combat across thousands of miles. But the British military establishment clung to a racial fantasy that would cost countless lives. The official assessment of Japanese military capability was staggering in its ignorance. British intelligence reports stated that Japanese soldiers had poor eyesight and could not fight at night. They claimed Japanese pilots were inferior because of inner ear defects that affected their balance. They insisted that Japanese tanks and aircraft were mere copies of Western designs, built shoddily and prone to breakdown. Australian officers who had actually studied the Japanese campaigns in China tried to correct these delusions. They pointed to the sophisticated tactics used at Shanghai. They highlighted the fanatical discipline of Japanese infantry. They warned that the Zero fighter was superior to anything the Allies had in the Pacific theater. The response was always the same: polite smiles and patronizing dismissals. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival arrived to take command of Malaya Command in May of 1941. He was a staff officer to his bones, meticulous with paperwork, but lacking the killer instinct that combat demands. He had served with distinction in the First World War and had experience fighting insurgents in Ireland and Malaya itself. But he was a man of defensive thinking, forever worried about his flanks, forever requesting more troops that would never arrive. Percival inherited a disaster waiting to happen. His forces were spread across the entire Malay Peninsula, too thin to hold any position properly. His air force was equipped with obsolete Buffalo fighters that would be massacred by Japanese Zeros. His naval support consisted of two capital ships, the battleship Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser Repulse, sent without aircraft carrier protection because London believed Singapore's land-based aircraft would suffice. Australian commanders looked at these dispositions and despaired, but their opinions were not solicited. The colonial troops were there to follow orders, not to question the wisdom of their betters. And then the moment of reckoning arrived. The Japanese struck on the 8th of December, 1941. While the world focused on Pearl Harbor, Lieutenant General Tomoyuki Yamashita launched his invasion of Malaya at Kota Baru on the northeastern coast. His forces landed under fire and immediately began pushing south. Everything the British thought impossible happened in the first 48 hours. Japanese troops moved through the supposedly impassable jungle with shocking speed. They used bicycles by the thousands, rolling down plantation roads and jungle paths, while British defenders waited for them on the main highways. When they encountered obstacles, they simply picked up their bicycles and walked around them. The sound of 10,000 bicycle wheels on gravel became the soundtrack of the British collapse. The Zero fighters swept the skies clean. The obsolete Buffaloes went down in flames, their pilots brave but hopelessly outmatched. Within days, the Japanese had complete air superiority over northern Malaya. British troops learned to fear the sound of aircraft engines because it always meant enemy planes. But the worst blow was yet to come. On the 10th of December, Japanese bombers found the Prince of Wales and Repulse steaming north without air cover. The attack lasted less than 2 hours. Both ships went to the bottom, taking over 800 sailors with them. Admiral Tom Phillips perished on his flagship, having sailed into disaster against the advice of subordinates who warned that operating without air cover was suicidal. Winston Churchill received the news in bed. He later wrote that in all the war, he never received a more direct shock. The entire British defensive strategy for the Far East had just sunk beneath the waves of the South China Sea. Now the full horror of the land campaign would unfold. The Australian 8th Division had trained for exactly this kind of war. Unlike their British counterparts, they had practiced jungle fighting. They understood the terrain. They had studied Japanese tactics, but they were positioned as just one piece of a crumbling defensive line, forced to operate under British command that seemed determined to repeat every possible mistake. The pattern of the Malayan campaign became sickeningly predictable. British and Indian units would establish a defensive line across a road. Japanese troops would infiltrate through the jungle and appear behind them. Panic would spread. The retreat would become a rout, and the Australians would be called in to cover the withdrawal. At Gemus on the 14th of January 1942, Australian troops finally got a chance to show what they could do when properly positioned. The 2nd 29th Battalion set a textbook ambush along a road bridge. They let the Japanese vanguard cross, then triggered a devastating crossfire that tore the enemy column apart. Over 1,000 Japanese soldiers fell in the trap. It was the first significant Allied victory of the campaign. It proved that Japanese soldiers could be stopped when faced with competent opposition using proper tactics. For a brief moment, it seemed the tide might turn, but one tactical success could not repair a strategic catastrophe. The victory at Gemus meant nothing to the overall situation. While the Australians were winning their battle, other sectors of the line were collapsing. The retreat continued. The pattern of defeat remained unbroken. General Bennett raged at the incompetence he witnessed daily. British units abandoning positions without orders, Indian troops thrown into battle with inadequate training, defensive lines drawn on maps without reference to actual terrain, orders issued and countermanded within hours. A command structure so confused that units sometimes received contradictory instructions from multiple headquarters. His complaints traveled up the chain of command and disappeared into silence. The colonials were being difficult again. Did they not understand that proper officers knew best? The Japanese advance continued at a pace that stunned observers around the world. Yamashita had planned for a 100-day campaign to reach Singapore. He would do it in 70. And now the island fortress itself lay exposed. The city of Singapore waited behind its supposedly impregnable defenses while disaster rolled toward it from the north. Over 1 million civilians packed the island. Refugees from the mainland flooded in daily with tales of Japanese atrocities and British incompetence. The mood shifted from confidence to anxiety to barely concealed panic. The great naval guns still pointed seaward, useless against an enemy approaching by land. The airfields were cratered ruins, their aircraft destroyed or withdrawn. The army that was supposed to defend the fortress was a battered remnant of the force that had existed 2 months earlier. Percival had roughly 85,000 troops under his command for the defense of Singapore Island. On paper, this was still a formidable force. In reality, many of these men were exhausted survivors of the mainland retreat. Others were barely trained reinforcements who had arrived just weeks or even days before the crisis. Morale was shattered. Ammunition was running low. The logistics system had collapsed. Yamashita had approximately 30,000 combat troops available for the assault. He was at the end of a 1,000-mile supply line. His men were tired from weeks of constant combat. His ammunition stocks were critically low. He had enough artillery shells for perhaps one major assault. By any rational calculation, the defenders should have held. 85,000 against 30,000. prepared positions against attackers crossing open water. The mathematics of military science favored Singapore. But Yamashita understood something that Percival did not. He understood that the British command had already lost the battle in their minds. The fortress mentality had become a prison of despair. The defenders were waiting to be attacked rather than planning to destroy their enemy. The Japanese general made his decision. He would attack before his opponents could recover their nerve. Speed had won every battle in Malaya. Speed would win the final prize. On the night of the 8th of February, the assault began. The Japanese crossed the Johor Strait under cover of darkness. Australian troops of the 22nd Brigade held the northwestern sector of the island where the main attack fell. They were spread impossibly thin, one battalion covering a front that should have been held by a division. The bombardment that preceded the crossing was devastating. Japanese artillery pounded the Australian positions for hours. Then the assault boats emerged from the darkness, packed with infantry determined to seize their objective or perish in the attempt. The Australians fought with desperate courage. Machine guns swept the water, turning assault boats into floating coffins. Mortar rounds burst among the Japanese as they struggled through the mud of the mangrove swamps. In some sectors, the defenders threw back multiple waves of attackers, but there were simply too few men to hold too long a line. Japanese troops found gaps in the defenses and poured through. By dawn, they had established multiple beachheads on the island. The battle for Singapore had become a battle for time. What happened next remains one of the most controversial episodes of the entire Pacific War. Communications broke down almost immediately. Units lost contact with headquarters. Commanders issued orders to troops who had already withdrawn or been overrun. The fog of war descended like a suffocating blanket. Australian soldiers who survived would later describe scenes of chaos and confusion, conflicting orders. Phantom Japanese units reported everywhere. British headquarters demanding counterattacks with forces that no longer existed. The sense that no one at the top had any idea what was actually happening. General Percival later claimed he was never properly informed of the situation on the ground. His subordinates claimed he refused to believe reports that contradicted his assumptions. The truth probably contains elements of both. What is certain is that the command structure failed at the moment when clear leadership was most desperately needed. And while the generals dithered, the soldiers paid the price. The Australian brigades fought their withdrawal with grim professionalism. They established blocking positions, held them until the last possible moment, then fell back to the next line. They made the Japanese pay for every mile. But they were fighting a battle that had already been lost at higher headquarters. The civilian population of Singapore experienced horrors that the official histories would later sanitize. Japanese aircraft bombed residential areas without restraint. Artillery shells fell on crowded streets. Fires raged unchecked as the water supply failed. Hospitals overflowed with wounded civilians and soldiers alike. The European population had been assured for years that Singapore was impregnable. Now they watched that fantasy burn. Ships leaving the harbor were packed with women and children desperate to escape. Many of those ships would be sunk by Japanese aircraft in the days ahead, their passengers lost to the sea. Asian residents of Singapore faced a different calculus. The Japanese had promised Asian peoples liberation from European colonialism. Some believed this propaganda. Most understood that Japanese occupation would bring its own terrors. The Chinese community in particular knew what to expect. Reports of Japanese atrocities in China had filtered through despite censorship. The final days of British Singapore were marked by scenes that would have been unimaginable weeks earlier. Looters breaking into abandoned European homes, soldiers drinking themselves insensible with liquor from shattered bars, officers burning classified documents while the perimeter collapsed around them. the entire structure of colonial authority dissolving into smoke and chaos. Through it all, the Australian troops continued fighting. They did not know it yet, but they were earning a reputation that their captors would remember for years to come. The Japanese advance into Singapore City was slowed, but never stopped. Yamashita knew he was racing against time. His ammunition was nearly exhausted. His supply lines were stretched to breaking. If the British organized a coherent counterattack, his entire invasion force might be destroyed. But no counterattack came. Percival had lost control of the battle. His forces were fragmented, exhausted, demoralized. The water supply for the city had been cut. Civilian casualties were mounting by the hour. The general who had spent his career preparing defensive plans found himself with no plan that could save the situation. On the 14th of February, Percival convened a meeting of his senior commanders. The consensus was devastating. Ammunition was nearly gone. The water supply could not be restored. The defensive perimeter had shrunk to the point where Japanese artillery could reach every part of the remaining position. Continued resistance would accomplish nothing except additional suffering. General Bennett argued for a breakout attempt. Let the organized formations try to escape into the jungle and fight as guerrillas. Let individual soldiers make their own way to safety. Anything was better than mass surrender. His proposal was rejected. Percival decided that the humanitarian crisis among the civilian population left him no choice. He would seek terms. The next morning, the 15th of February, a British staff car flying a white flag drove toward Japanese lines. Inside sat General Percival, his face gaunt with exhaustion and defeat. He was going to surrender the largest British force ever to lay down its arms. Yamashita received him at the Ford Motor Factory in Bukit Timah. The Japanese general was gruff and impatient. He demanded unconditional surrender. Percival tried to negotiate terms for the protection of civilians. Yamashita slammed his hand on the table and repeated his demand. The document was signed at 17:25 hours. Over 80,000 soldiers became prisoners of war. The Gibraltar of the East had fallen. But the nightmare was only beginning. The immediate aftermath brought horrors that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. Japanese troops, released from the discipline of combat, rampaged through sections of the city. The Chinese population suffered particularly savage treatment. Estimates of civilian casualties during the massacre that followed range from 25,000 to 50,000. Australian prisoners were herded into Changi prison and its surrounding camps. Conditions in those first weeks were chaotic, but not yet genocidal. The Japanese had captured far more prisoners than they expected and had made no adequate provision for their care. But the prisoners did not yet know what awaited them. They did not know about the Burma Railway. They did not know about Sandakan. They did not know about the 1,000 ways that Japanese captivity would test the limits of human endurance. What they knew, as they sat in the tropical heat of Changi, was that they had been betrayed. Not by their mates who had fought beside them, not by the junior officers who had shared their hardships, but by a system, a hierarchy, an imperial structure that had valued its own assumptions over their lives. And the world was already asking how this could have happened. The fall of Singapore sent shockwaves through the entire Allied world. The myth of European invincibility in Asia had been shattered beyond repair. Peoples across the region who had been told that Western colonialism was permanent now saw that the masters could be defeated. In Australia, the news hit with the force of a physical blow. The 8th Division had been the pride of the nation. Now its men were prisoners, their fate unknown. Japanese forces were suddenly within striking distance of Australian soil. The war that had seemed distant was now terrifyingly close. Prime Minister John Curtin had already made his famous declaration that Australia looked to America. free of any pangs about traditional ties to Britain. Singapore confirmed the wisdom of that decision. The empire had failed. The mother country had proved unable to protect her children. Australia would have to find her own path. The recriminations began almost immediately. How had the impregnable fortress fallen in 7 days? Who was responsible for the disaster? Why had the warnings been ignored? The British government launched an inquiry that produced carefully worded conclusions blaming circumstances rather than individuals. The fog of war, the unexpected strength of the Japanese, the difficult terrain. Explanations that explained nothing. Australian historians would dig deeper. They found the reports that had been ignored. They interviewed the officers whose advice had been dismissed. They documented the pattern of contempt that had treated colonial input as irrelevant. The truth was damning. Singapore fell, not because the Japanese were invincible, but because the British refused to believe that Bushmen might understand warfare better than Whitehall. The soldiers who warned of jungle infiltration, who predicted the weakness of the northern approach, who demanded realistic assessment of Japanese capabilities, had been silenced by institutional arrogance. General Bennett escaped Singapore in a small boat and eventually made his way back to Australia. He was controversial in life and remains controversial in historical memory. Some called him a deserter who abandoned his men. Others argued he had skills the nation needed. His post-war life was marked by bitterness and recrimination. General Percival survived captivity and lived until 1966. He spent his remaining years defending decisions that had cost 80,000 men their freedom. He never adequately acknowledged the warnings he had ignored or the voices he had silenced. The soldiers of the 8th Division emerged from captivity in 1945, those who survived. Many found that the nation had moved on, that their ordeal was already becoming history. They carried their memories quietly, as Australians do, but the lessons remained unlearned by those who needed them most. The lessons of Singapore should have been obvious. Do not assume that your enemy is inferior because of his race. Do not dismiss warnings from men who know the terrain. Do not let institutional arrogance override operational reality. Do not sacrifice soldiers on the altar of imperial pride. These lessons were paid for in blood and suffering. 3.5 years of captivity, the Burma Railway, Sandakan, names that still carry the weight of tragedy 80 years later. But lessons paid for in blood are often the first to be forgotten. The same patterns of arrogance, the same dismissal of inconvenient voices, the same preference for comfortable assumptions over harsh realities have appeared in conflicts since. They will appear again. What remains is the memory. The Australian soldiers who stood in the jungle night, hearing the bicycle wheels on the road, knowing the enemy was coming. The officers who sent warning after warning to headquarters that refused to listen. The men who fought their retreat with discipline and courage, while the command structure collapsed around them. They were bushmen. They were colonials. They were sheep shearers and cattle drovers playing at soldiers. And they knew everything that mattered. They knew the Japanese were coming through the jungle. They knew the defensive strategy was fatally flawed. They knew that arrogance would exact a terrible price. The generals who ignored them had polished boots and cut-glass accents and the confidence of men who had never been wrong in their lives. They drew lines on maps and issued orders from air-conditioned offices and assured each other that everything was under control. When the reckoning came, it was not the generals who paid the price. It was the men they had dismissed, the men who had tried to warn them, the men who spent 3.5 years in captivity because their betters refused to listen. The prisoners who marched into Changi carried something with them that their captors could not take. They carried the knowledge of who they were and what they had done. They had fought against impossible odds. They had held their positions when others fled. They had maintained discipline when the command structure dissolved into chaos. The Japanese guards would learn quickly that these Australian prisoners were different. They did not break easily. They did not inform on their mates. They maintained their unit structures and their chains of command even in captivity. When they could not resist openly, they resisted quietly. The great tragedy of Singapore is not that it fell. Fortresses fall. Armies surrender. These things happen in war. The tragedy is that it did not have to happen the way it did. Tens of thousands of men did not have to spend years in captivity. Thousands did not have to perish from disease and brutality and starvation. Different decisions at the top could have changed everything. A realistic assessment of Japanese capabilities, a defensive strategy based on actual terrain rather than comfortable assumptions, a command structure that listened to warnings rather than dismissing them. None of this happened because the men at the top knew better. They had studied at Sandhurst. They had served in proper regiments. They understood modern warfare in ways that Bushmen from the colonies could never comprehend. That certainty cost 80,000 men their freedom. It cost thousands their lives. It changed the course of history in ways that still resonate today. The Australian troops who fought at Singapore deserve to be remembered, not as victims of Japanese aggression alone, but as men who were failed by a system that valued imperial pride over human lives. They were right about the jungle. They were right about the Japanese. They were right about the northern approach. They were right about everything that mattered. And they paid the price for being ignored. February 15 remains a day of commemoration in Australia. It marks the fall of Singapore and the beginning of the captivity that would test the Anzac spirit to its limits. Veterans and their descendants gather to remember what was lost and what was endured. The story is usually told as a tragedy of war, the unstoppable Japanese advance, the overwhelmed defenders, the impossible situation that left no choice but surrender. But there is another story beneath that surface narrative. A story of warnings unheeded and voices silenced. A story of arrogance so complete that it became indistinguishable from negligence. A story of men who knew the truth being dismissed because of where they came from and how they spoke. Those words, spoken in various forms by various British officers throughout the Malayan campaign, should stand as an epitaph for imperial arrogance. The Bushmen know nothing about modern warfare. They should be carved into memorial stones and printed in history books. They should be remembered whenever comfortable men in comfortable offices dismiss warnings from people who actually know what they are talking about. The Australian soldiers at Singapore knew exactly what they were talking about. They knew the jungle. They knew the enemy. They knew what needed to be done. They were not asked. They were told. They were told that proper officers had everything under control. They were told that the fortress was impregnable. They were told that their concerns were the nervous complaints of colonials who did not understand real warfare. And then they were marched into Changi to begin 3.5 years of captivity. The survivors came home, changed. Some found it impossible to speak of what they had endured. Others could not stop speaking of it, trapped in memories that would never release them. The mates who did not return were with them always, a presence felt in quiet moments and crowded rooms alike. Australian society has never fully reckoned with what Singapore means. It is easier to focus on Gallipoli, where the sacrifice was cleaner and the enemy was not also the captor. It is easier to remember Tobruk and Kokoda, where Australian soldiers stood and won rather than surrendered. But Singapore is part of the story too, perhaps the most important part, because Singapore shows what happens when the men at the top stop listening to the men at the bottom. when assumptions replace intelligence, when arrogance overrides warning. The 8th Division did not fail at Singapore. The system failed them. The imperial structure that was supposed to protect them became the instrument of their destruction. They trusted their commanders to make competent decisions, and that trust was betrayed. This is not the story that empires like to tell about themselves. It is much more comfortable to blame the enemy, the weather, the terrain, the lack of resources, anything rather than admit that the men in charge were wrong. But the truth matters. It matters for the memory of those who suffered. It matters for the lessons that future generations might learn. It matters because the same patterns of arrogance and dismissal continue to cost lives today. The final reckoning for Singapore came not in official inquiries or historical debates, but in the changed relationship between Australia and the rest of the world. The nation that entered the war as a loyal dominion of the British Empire emerged as something different, older, warier, less willing to accept that distant authorities knew best. The phrase "great and powerful friends" entered the Australian political vocabulary during the war years. It carried with it an implicit acknowledgement that friends could fail you, that protectors could become captors of a different kind, that the only security that truly mattered was the security you built yourself. This is the legacy of Singapore. Not just the tragedy, but the transformation. Not just the defeat, but the determination that it would never happen again. Australian defence policy for the next 80 years would be shaped by what happened in February of 1942. The men who survived Changi and the Burma Railway and Sandakan carried this lesson in their bones. They did not need academics to explain it to them. They had lived it. They knew what happened when you trusted people who dismissed your warnings because they thought they knew better. Many of those survivors never spoke publicly about their experiences. They went back to their farms and their workshops and their offices and built the nation that exists today. They raised families and watched grandchildren play in the sunshine of a peace that their sacrifice had purchased. But they remembered. They always remembered. The bicycle wheels on the jungle road, the falling bombs and the burning ships, the march into captivity and the years of darkness that followed, the mates who did not come home, and they remembered the words that had sealed their fate, the dismissal that had led to disaster, the arrogance that had cost them everything. They knew everything, and they proved it, not in victory, but in the way they endured defeat, in the discipline they maintained when the command structure failed, in the mateship that saw them through 3.5 years of captivity, in the quiet courage that asked for no recognition and expected no reward. These were the men who built Australia, not the generals who lost Singapore, but the soldiers who survived it, not the voices of authority, but the voices that were silenced. Their story deserves to be told. Their truth deserves to be remembered. The Bushmen knew everything. The generals knew nothing. And 80 years later, that truth still echoes across the Australian continent.